In 1908, in a valley in Canada's Northwest Territories so remote that it can only be reached by floatplane, a man named Charlie McLeod found his two missing brothers dead around their camp. The fire was cold. The supplies were untouched. What had been done to their bodies matched no animal, no weapon, and no cause of death in any record. The third man who had entered the valley with them was never found. Not his body, not his gear, not a single trace. 9 years later, a Swiss prospector named Martin Jorgensen sent letters out of the valley claiming he had struck gold. Shortly after, his cabin was found burned to the ground. His remains were inside. He had died the same way the McLeod brothers had died. No cause was ever determined. In 1926, a woman named Annie Leferte entered the valley. Eyewitnesses saw her running screaming into the wilderness, tearing off her own clothing as she ran. Months later, an indigenous man reported seeing her climbing a near vertical cliff face, completely naked, moving in a way that should not have been physically possible. She was never seen again. In 1931, a man named Phil Powers was found in the ashes of his cabin. Same pattern. Burned structure, dead owner, no explanation. In 1962, a bush pilot crashed his plane into a mountain inside the valley. He survived the impact. He set up camp. He kept a journal. For 46 days, he wrote entries documenting his survival. Then the entries stopped. When they found his plane and his camp and his journal, there was no body, no trail, no sign of where he had gone. He simply ceased to exist. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police have documented at least 44 deaths or disappearances in this valley since 1905. The official maps label the landmarks inside it: Deadman Valley, Headless Creek, Funeral Range. These are not nicknames. These are the names the Canadian government gave these places because of what kept happening there. The Dene, the indigenous people who have lived in this region for thousands of years, will not enter certain parts of this valley. They speak of the Naha, a fierce mountain-dwelling tribe that once raided their settlements from the high country. The Naha were feared for generations, and then one day the Dene went up into the mountains to confront them, and the Naha were gone. Cold campfires, empty shelters, no bodies, no graves, no trace. An entire people had vanished from the face of the earth. The valley they left behind has been taking people ever since. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Thanks. My name is Alex, and what I am about to walk you through is one of the most documented and least understood patterns of death and disappearance in North American wilderness. This is not folklore. These are RCMP case files, geographic survey records, and indigenous oral histories that stretch back further than any written record. The valley is called Naha. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is one of the last truly unexplored places on the continent. And for 120 years, people have been entering it and dying in ways that no authority, no investigator, and no scientist has ever been able to explain. And today, I will try to piece together the clues we have gathered in over a century. Let me start by describing this place, because the landscape itself is part of the story, and I need you to understand something before we go any further. This is not a national park with visitor centers and paved trails and gift shops selling postcards. This is one of the last true wildernesses on Earth, the kind of place where, once you are inside it, you are on your own in every sense of the word. The Naha Valley sits in the Decho region of Canada's Northwest Territories, roughly 300 miles west of Yellowknife. The park reserve covers over 11,500 square miles, which makes it larger than the state of Maryland. There are no roads leading into it, no maintained trails, no bridges, no marked paths, except for the game trails worn into the ground by caribou and wolves. The only way in is by floatplane or by navigating the South Nahanni River, which is Class 3 and 4 whitewater for much of its length. When the floatplane drops you off at one of the designated landing sites and the engine fades and the pilot disappears over the ridge, the silence hits you like a wall. There is nothing. No cell service, no radio towers, no emergency response within hundreds of miles, no other human beings anywhere near you. Just you and the valley and whatever else happens to live inside it. 4 massive canyons line the South Nahanni River, each with walls reaching over 3,000 feet. That is deeper than the Grand Canyon. The first canyon, which is considered the most beautiful, has walls so vertical and so high that standing at the bottom feels less like being in a landscape and more like standing inside something that is looking down at you. Virginia Falls drops 315 feet, which is twice the height of Niagara Falls. In winter, the falls freeze into a wall of blue and white ice that stretches across the full width of the gorge. The park contains geysers that have been boiling for millennia, limestone sinkholes large enough to swallow buildings, hot springs at a place called Rabbit Kettle, where scalding water has been pouring out of the earth since before recorded history, building terraced mineral formations that glow orange and white against the dark forest surrounding them. There are cave systems that have never been fully mapped or explored, and above all of it, the Mackenzie Mountains rise into country so remote that some of the granite towers in a formation called the Cirque of the Unclimbables have only been summited a handful of times in human history. But here is the detail that stopped me when I was researching this. Look at the names on the official Canadian government maps. The canyon system in the center of the valley is labeled Deadmen Valley. The creek running through it is called Headless Creek. The mountain range to the south is the Headless Range, and the peaks beyond that are called the Funeral Range. These are not names that locals made up around campfires. These are the names that the Canadian government put on its own official cartographic surveys. They named the mountains after what happened to the people who went into them. I have covered a lot of wilderness on this channel. I have never come across a place where the map itself reads like a warning. To understand what has been happening in this valley, you have to go back further than any RCMP case file, further than any written record. You have to go back to the people who have known this land the longest, and what they have to say is not comforting. The Diné people, sometimes called the Slavey, have inhabited the lands in and around the Nahanni Valley for at least 9,000 to 10,000 years. Archaeological evidence at Yohin Lake and other sites within the park confirm human presence stretching back to the end of the last ice age. These are not newcomers. The Dene were here when the glaciers were still retreating. They watched this valley take its current shape. They are the legal ancestral owners of the land, and they are the people who gave the valley its name. That name tells you something important. Nahanni is a Diné word. It means river of the land of the Naha people. The valley is not named after the Diné themselves. It is named after someone else, someone who was there before them, or at least someone who lived in a part of the valley that the Dene would not go. According to Diné oral history, the Naha were a separate mountain-dwelling tribe who lived in the high country above the valley floor. They were feared more than anything else in the Dene world. The Dene described them as fierce raiders who would descend from the mountains without warning, attack Dene settlements in the lowlands with brutal efficiency, and then vanish back into the mist before anyone could pursue them. Some Diné accounts describe them as unusually large. Others refer to them simply as the people of the mountains. The stories vary from community to community, but what is consistent across every account is the fear. The Deen were terrified of the Naha. They would only speak of them in whispers. They believed that saying the name too loudly could attract their attention. And for generations, the Deen avoided the upper reaches of the valley entirely because that was Naha territory, and entering it meant risking contact with something the Deen believed was too dangerous to confront. And then, one day, the Naha disappeared. The Deen oral histories say that after generations of raids, the Deen finally gathered enough warriors to go into the mountains and confront the Naha directly. They climbed into the high country. They reached the Naha settlements, and they found nothing. The campfires were cold. The shelters were empty. There were no bodies, no graves, no signs of battle or disease or migration. No blood, no weapons. Nothing was taken, and nothing was left behind except the structures themselves, standing empty in the mountain air. An entire people had simply ceased to exist. The Deen searched. They found nothing. And in the years and decades and centuries that followed, no one ever found anything. No archaeological evidence of the Naha has ever been recovered by modern researchers. No remains, no tools, no structures, no genetic trace, nothing that would confirm their physical existence beyond the Deen's own oral tradition. Some researchers have theorized that the Naha migrated south, and there is a linguistic argument for this. The Deen language belongs to the Athabascan family, and Athabascan languages are also spoken by the Navajo and Apache in the American Southwest. The distance between the Nahanni and the Navajo homeland is roughly 1,500 miles as the crow flies, which is a long way, but not impossible for a nomadic people over the span of generations. But no physical evidence of this migration has ever been found. No trail of artifacts or settlements connecting the Naha to any people further south. The Naha are, as of today, a people who exist only in the memory of the people who feared them. They are a ghost nation, and the valley named after them has been acting like something still exists in it ever since they left. The Deen also speak of an unknown evil dwelling within the 200-mile gorge, the deepest and most inaccessible part of the valley. They call it the most dangerous stretch of the Nahanni. Most Deen will not enter it, not because of the cold, not because of the terrain, not because of the animals, because of what the elders say inhabits the area. The elders do not describe it in detail. They do not give it a clear shape. They simply say it is there, and that people who go into that part of the valley do not always come back. I want you to sit with that for a moment. The Deen have survived in one of the harshest environments on Earth for 10,000 years. They have endured ice ages, starvation, warfare, and the arrival of European colonization. They know this land better than anyone alive, and they will not go into certain parts of their own valley. These are not people who scare easily. When they say something is in there, I am inclined to take that very seriously. Now let me walk you through what started happening when outsiders entered the valley, because this is where the documented pattern begins, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. In 1896, the Klondike Gold Rush sent thousands of prospectors pushing north and west across the Canadian subarctic. Most of them were headed for the Yukon, for Bonanza Creek and Dawson City, where gold had been found in the river gravel. But some of them heard rumors of gold in the South Nahanni and Flat Rivers, and they decided to test their luck in the valley instead. These were hard men, experienced in the bush, accustomed to extreme cold and isolation and danger. They had crossed mountain ranges on foot. They had survived winters that killed their horses. They were not amateurs wandering into the woods with a dream and a pickaxe. They were frontier professionals who had already proven they could survive almost anything. and the valley killed them anyway. The McLeod brothers were among the first. Willie and Frank McLeod were Métis prospectors who had already been into the Naha once before. In 1904, they entered the valley on their first expedition and came back convinced they had found a significant gold deposit. They returned home with samples, or at the very least with enough conviction to immediately begin planning a return trip. In 1905, they went back in, this time accompanied by a Scottish engineer whose full identity remains uncertain. He is known in most records simply as Weir. Some accounts identify him as Robert Weir. Others do not name him at all. What is known is that he was brought along because the brothers believed they needed someone with technical expertise to evaluate and develop whatever they had found. The three men entered the valley in the summer of 1905 and were never heard from again. 1 year passed, then 2. No word, no letters, nothing. Then their brother Charlie organized a search party and went in after them. He found their camp along a creek that would later be named Bennett Creek. The fire pit was cold. The supplies were still there. Both brothers were dead. Now, I need to be careful here, because YouTube has content policies that I respect, and I am going to keep things appropriate throughout this video. But I will tell you this much. The valley has another name. The locals and the RCMP and even the Canadian government's own maps call it the Valley of the Headless Men. I think the details of what Charlie McLeod found at that campsite should be clear to you from that name alone. I will leave the specifics to your imagination, and I suspect your imagination is more than sufficient. What I will say is that the condition of those bodies did not match any known animal attack, any conventional weapon, or any recognized cause of death. And the third man, the engineer Weir, was never found. Not a bone, not a boot, not a scrap of clothing, not a single trace. He vanished as completely as the Naha had vanished centuries before him. Charlie McLeod buried his brothers and marked the graves with a cross. The rumored gold deposit they had been searching for was never located. It became known as the Lost McLeod Mine, and it entered frontier legend as one of the great undiscovered treasures of the Canadian North. Over the following decades, many people would enter the valley looking for it. A disturbing number of them would never come out. In 1917, a Swiss prospector named Martin Jorgensen built a cabin deep in the valley near the Flat River. He spent time there alone, working the creeks and the riverbanks. He sent letters to contacts outside the valley claiming he had struck gold. He may have found the same source the McLeods had died looking for. We will never know. Because shortly after those letters were sent, Jorgensen's cabin was found burned to the ground. His remains were inside the ashes. He had died in the same manner as the McLeod brothers. The details that I am choosing not to describe matched. His gold, if he ever had any, was never recovered. The RCMP investigated. They found nothing. No suspect, no motive, no explanation. Just a burned cabin and a dead man who died the same way other men had died in this valley a decade earlier. In the late 1920s, a man known as Yukon Fisher was found dead within the valley. Fisher was not an ordinary prospector. He was an outlaw. Years earlier, he had gotten into a fight in a Yukon saloon, cracked a man's head open with a bottle, and believing he had killed the man, fled into the bush. For years after that, he lived as a fugitive in total isolation in the subarctic wilderness, surviving entirely alone, avoiding all human contact. He was described by the few people who encountered him at remote trading posts as enormous, covered in furs, and completely self-sufficient. He had survived years in country that kills most people in days. This was a man who had proven beyond any doubt that he could handle the worst the northern wilderness could throw at him. and something in the Naha Valley killed him. Then came Annie Leferte in 1926, and her case is the one that shifts everything, because the McLeods and Jorgensen and Fisher, you can theorize about those. Robbery gone wrong, rival prospectors, bear attack that left unusual marks. You can construct a rational explanation if you squint hard enough and ignore the pattern. But Annie Leferte does not fit any rational explanation I have ever encountered. She entered the valley and something happened to her. Eyewitnesses, and there were eyewitnesses, described her running screaming into the forest, ripping off her own clothing as she ran. That is not the behavior of someone fleeing an animal or a human attacker. That is the behavior of someone in a state of absolute psychological disintegration. Something broke her mind. Something she saw or experienced in that valley shattered her so completely that she abandoned every survival instinct a human being has and ran naked into the subarctic wilderness. And then, months later, an indigenous man named Big Charlie reported seeing her. She was still alive. She was climbing a near vertical cliff face, naked, in a remote area of the valley, moving in a way that, by all accounts, should not have been physically possible for a human being in her condition. How do you survive months alone, naked, in the northern Canadian wilderness? What do you eat? Where do you sleep? How are you still alive, let alone scaling cliff faces? She was never seen again after Big Charlie's sighting. No body was ever found. No explanation was ever offered. Annie Leferte became part of the valley, and the valley has never given her back. In 1931, Phil Powers was found in the ashes of his burned cabin. The RCMP officially attributed the fire to a faulty stovepipe. This explanation was challenged by multiple sources at the time and has been questioned by researchers ever since. Phil Powers is case number 4 in the burned cabin pattern. 4 separate cabins built by 4 separate people over a span of decades in different parts of the valley, all found burned to the ground. All occupants found dead or missing. A faulty stovepipe does not explain a pattern that repeats itself across 30 years and multiple unconnected individuals. And the list continued to grow. Angus Hall disappeared without a trace, leaving nothing behind. Annie Leferte, as I described, vanished into the wilderness. Joe Mulholland and Bill Ipier shared a cabin in the valley. Their cabin was found burned to the ground. Same pattern, same absence of answers, same impossible repetition. Now, there is one thread in this story that I need to address directly, because it offers a partial explanation for some of these deaths, and I want to emphasize the word partial. About 40 miles from the Naha Valley, there lived a reclusive man named Albert Johnson. In late 1931, the RCMP went to question him about reports that he was interfering with indigenous trap lines. Johnson responded by shooting through his cabin door and wounding a constable. What followed was one of the most extraordinary manhunts in Canadian history. Johnson fled into the subarctic winter, and the RCMP pursued him on foot and by dog sled for over 90 miles across some of the most brutal terrain in the Northwest Territories. The pursuit lasted more than a month, through temperatures that dropped well below -40. Johnson was an astonishingly capable survivalist. He crossed mountain passes in blizzard conditions that should have killed him. He doubled back on his own trail to confuse the dogs. He traveled distances in single days that the RCMP teams could not match. He was finally cornered and killed in a shootout on Eagle River in the Yukon in February 1932. The event became a media sensation. Newspapers across Canada covered what they called the hunt for the mad trapper of Rat River. When the RCMP searched Johnson's possessions after his death, they found something that connected him directly to the Naha. He had gold teeth in his possession that had been extracted from the mouths of prospectors who had been found dead in the valley. The RCMP opened a file linking Johnson to some of the Naha killings, and he may well have been responsible for some of them. A man living alone in the wilderness, 40 miles from the valley, with gold teeth from dead prospectors in his pockets. The evidence is circumstantial but compelling. However, Johnson's timeline does not account for all the deaths. The McLeod brothers died in or before 1905. Johnson is not known to have been in the region at that time. The burned cabin pattern includes incidents that precede and post-date his presence, and the deaths and disappearances continued for decades after Johnson was killed in 1932, the 1945 miner, the 1946 expedition, Brunchnik in 1957, the 4 deaths in 1962, the 2 hunters in 2005. So Johnson may explain a part of the pattern, but he does not explain the pattern itself. Something was happening in the Naha Valley before Albert Johnson arrived, and it continued long after he was dead and buried. Whatever killed the McLeods in 1905, and whatever killed Horsey and Hardesty in 2005, is not the same man. It is not any man. It is something else. You might be thinking that these are old stories, gold rush era frontier deaths in a time before modern equipment and communications. Tragic but explainable by the sheer brutality of the conditions. I thought that too, until I looked at what happened next. Because the deaths did not stop when the gold rush ended. They continued through the 20th century and into the 21st. And the modern cases are, in some ways, more disturbing than the old ones, because the people involved had better equipment, better maps, and more experience, and they died anyway. In 1945, an unidentified miner from Ontario was found dead in his sleeping bag inside the valley. The manner of his death matched the pattern of earlier victims. He was never identified. Think about that. A man traveled hundreds or thousands of miles to enter a valley that was already known for killing people. He died in the same way others had died before him, and no one ever figured out who he was. He remains a John Doe to this day. A man whose name no one knows, who went into the Naha and never came out, and whose family, if he had one, may never have learned what happened to him. In 1946, 2 experienced frontiersmen named Henderson and Patterson planned a joint expedition into the valley. They arranged to meet at Virginia Falls, the 315-foot waterfall near the center of the park. Henderson arrived first, traveling from the west with 5 First Nations guides. Patterson was coming from the east by way of the Mackenzie River. He never showed up. Henderson waited at the falls. Days passed. Patterson never appeared. A search was eventually conducted. He was never found. Not a trace. Henderson, a man with decades of backcountry experience who had spent his entire adult life in the northern wilderness, later described his time in the valley to a journalist named George Murray. Murray noted that Henderson was visibly shaken during the interview. A lifetime frontiersman who had seen every kind of hardship the North could produce was afraid of what he had experienced in that valley. In 1957, a prospector named Leonard Brunchnik entered the valley looking for the lost McLeod mine, the same gold deposit that had drawn the McLeod brothers to their deaths 50 years earlier was still pulling people in. Brunchnik was found months later on a shelf of a riverbank, lying face down in a mat of dried blood and vomit. His death was never satisfactorily explained. In 1962, the valley took 4 more people, possibly 5. The first was a bush pilot named Angus Blake Mackenzie. In January of that year, his plane crashed into a mountain inside the valley. He survived the impact. This is confirmed because he set up a camp near the wreckage and began writing a journal. For 46 days, he documented his survival. He had gear from the plane. He had supplies. He clearly had the skills to keep himself alive in subarctic winter conditions. And then, on the 46th day, the journal entries stopped, not with a final message, not with a goodbye. They simply stopped, as if the man writing them had been interrupted mid-thought and never returned to finish the sentence. When a search team found his plane and his camp and his journal 6 months later, there was no body, no trail leading away from the camp, no sign of predator activity, no indication of what had happened. A man who had survived alone for a month and a half after a plane crash in one of the most hostile environments on Earth simply vanished. The journal sat there, open to the last page, waiting for an entry that would never come. That same year, a pilot named Kenneth Stockwell flew 3 men named Victor Huden, Gunther Goetz, and Henry Bursern into the valley for an expedition. Months later, the wreckage of Stockwell's plane and Huden's body were found near Virginia Falls. Stockwell, Goetz, and Buser were never found. 3 men simply gone. No bodies, no explanation. And in 2005, 2 hunters named David Horsey and Frederick Hardesty vanished from their rented cabin in the valley. This was not the frontier era. This was the 21st century. These men had modern equipment, modern communications, a rented structure with walls and a roof. David's body was found several miles from where he had been staying. Frederick was found floating in the North Nahanni River. The circumstances of their deaths were never explained. Their families demanded answers from the RCMP. They received none. The RCMP confirmed publicly that these modern incidents are part of a documented pattern that includes at least 44 deaths or disappearances in the region since 1908. I want to let that number sit with you. 44, in one valley, over 1 century, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, one of the most respected law enforcement agencies in the world, has not been able to explain the pattern. Not a single theory they have advanced accounts for all of the deaths. Not exposure, not murder, not animal attacks, not accidents. Every explanation covers some of the cases and fails on the rest. So what is doing this? I have given you the case files. I have given you the timeline. I have given you the pattern. Now let me give you what the people who have known this land for 10,000 years believe, because their explanations do not fit neatly into a police report, but they have the weight of 100 generations of direct experience behind them. The Dine do not separate the natural world from the spiritual world the way Western thinking does. They do not categorize phenomena into neat boxes labeled explained and unexplained. What the Dine understand about the Nahanni is more holistic and in some ways more honest than any RCMP investigation has managed to be. The Naha are the first and most prominent element, the vanished tribe. Some Dine elders believe the Naha never truly left the valley, that they retreated deeper into the mountains, into the places where no human being goes, and that they are still there. The raids on the lowland settlements stopped, but the presence in the high country did not. When outsiders enter the valley and do not come back, some Dine attribute this to the Naha, still protecting territory that they have occupied since before the Dine arrived. There are also the stories of the Wahila. In Dine tradition, the Wahila is a creature described as a massive white wolf, far larger than any known wolf species, with a broad head and thick legs. It is associated specifically with the Nahanni Valley and with the deaths that occur there. Descriptions of the Wahila predate European contact by centuries and come from multiple Dine communities independently. This is not one person's story. This is a creature that appears across the oral traditions of an entire region. Some Dini accounts speak of giants living in the valley who use the scalding hot springs at Rabbit Kettle to prepare their food. Others describe a weather spirit that haunts the gorge, making its presence known with shrieks that do not sound like wind or animals or anything else in the natural world, particularly on cold nights when the temperature drops, and the canyon walls amplify sound in ways that can make a single noise seem to come from everywhere at once. I am not going to tell you which of these explanations is correct. That is not my job, and it is not my place. What I will tell you is this. The Deen have been in this region for 10,000 years. They have survived everything the natural world can throw at a human civilization. They have an unbroken oral tradition that predates written history by thousands of years. And their conclusion, arrived at over hundreds of generations of direct experience with this land, is that certain parts of this valley are not safe for human beings. Not because of the cold, not because of the terrain, not because of the bears or the wolves or the rapids, because of something else, something that does not have a name in English, something that the landmarks on the map only hint at. When a people who have lived somewhere for 10 millennia tell you not to go to a specific place, and then outsiders go to that place and die in ways that cannot be explained, at some point, you have to consider the possibility that the people who have been there the longest might know something the rest of us do not. In 1976, the Canadian government designated the Naha as a national park reserve. 2 years later, in 1978, UNESCO inscribed it as a World Heritage Site, making it one of the first natural sites in the world to receive that designation. In 2009, the park was expanded massively to over 11,500 square miles in a partnership between the Canadian government and the Decho First Nations. The Deen are the legal owners of the land. They agreed to the park designation. The expanded boundary now includes the highest mountains and largest ice fields in the Northwest Territories, along with an estimated 500 grizzly bears, herds of woodland caribou, and alpine sheep and goats. But here is the detail I want you to notice, because it is easy to miss. The park was created in partnership with the Dini. The Dini agreed to protect the land. They did not agree to open it. There are no visitor centers inside the park, no lodges, no permanent structures, no campgrounds. Access is strictly controlled through permits and designated landing sites. The rangers manage who goes in, how many, and where they can go. The park exists, in part, as a form of institutional boundary around a place that the Deen had already marked as restricted generations before any government got involved. The permits and the landing sites and the regulations, those are the modern version of the restriction. But the original restriction, the one that matters, came from the Deen. And it was not based on conservation policy or tourism management. It was based on 10,000 years of knowing what this valley does to people who go too far inside it. Here is where I leave you. The Naha Valley is still there, still remote, still accessible only by floatplane or by navigating some of the most dangerous whitewater in North America. People still go. Paddlers still run the South Naha River. Hikers enter the backcountry with their permits and their satellite phones and their bear spray. Climbers visit the cirque of the unclimbables and test themselves against granite walls that most human beings will never see. And the valley is still taking people. The RCMP file on Naha remains open. It has been open for over a century. Here is what I keep coming back to. 120 years of documentation, 44 confirmed deaths or disappearances, cabins found burned with their owners dead inside, bodies found in conditions that do not match any known cause. A woman seen climbing a cliff face in a state of apparent madness months after she should have been dead. A pilot who survived 46 days after a plane crash and then ceased to exist without leaving a footprint. An entire indigenous tribe that vanished from the mountains without leaving a single physical trace. A pattern that has repeated itself across generations of people who had no connection to each other, no knowledge of each other, and no reason to die the same way in the same valley over and over and over again. The RCMP has no explanation that covers all of it. The Park Service has no explanation. The scientists who have studied the region have no explanation. The Dean have explanations, but they are not the kind that fit into a police report or a scientific paper. They are the kind that fit into 10,000 years of living alongside something that most of us would prefer not to believe exists. Some places are not meant to be understood. Some places are only meant to be survived. The Dean have known this for as long as anyone has had memory. The rest of us keep walking in and learning it the hard way. If you made it this far, thank you. Leave a comment and tell me what you think is responsible for what has been happening in this valley. I have read every theory I can find, and I still do not have an answer that covers all of it. Maybe you do. Hit subscribe if you have not already, and I will see you in the next one.